What's going on, Salt Strong Nation? Today I'm going to be giving you 3 tips on how you can catch more fish around heavy structure like rocks and oysters. These are great areas to target in the springtime because, as we know, most game fish just have feeding on their mind in the spring. They're not battling the heavy cold temperatures of winter or the really hot temperatures of summer yet, so they're just focused on feeding. And all the new bait fish and shrimp that are around in the springtime make for really good meals, and all that bait likes to congregate around structure like rocks and oysters. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about ways to position on this type of structure, what lures you're going to want to use, all of the different facets of how to fish this structure because it's a very highly productive zone to be fishing in the springtime. So let's go ahead and dive in with the first tip, which is determining the flow of current. This is really, really important because, as we know, most predator fish are going to position themselves for an easy meal. What that means is they're going to sit in the current with their nose facing the flow. That way, when a bait fish is brought with the current, they can easily pick it off without having to swim around and hunt or things like that. Now, when you're fishing around this structure, determining the flow of current is important because, for example, if there's water coming over a set of rocks or a small jetty wall, things like that, that water is going to be bringing bait over the rocks or through the rocks if there's small holes in them. And those predators are going to be positioned behind the rocks waiting for that bait to come to them. Just makes for a very easy meal. So what you need to do is cast up towards those rocks, make sure that you're retrieving with that current like it's a small bait fish or a small shrimp that's getting kind of blown with that current, and wait for that hookup as you're bouncing or slow swimming a paddle tail, because that's where those bait fish are going to be moving and that's where those predators are going to be feeding. So this is how I fish pretty much every single piece of structure, whether it's a rock or an oyster bar. All I have to do is recognize where that bait is getting moved with the current around that structure, because that's where those predators are going to be feeding. Now, moving on to tip 2, and that's fishing as close to the rocks as possible. A lot of these predators are sticking really close to that structure, especially at higher tides. They're meandering up around those rocks, especially redfish as they're kind of looking for crabs or small shrimp that are feeding on the microorganisms of the rocks themselves. They're going to be right up on that structure. So you need to put your bait right up in that structure as well. So casting as close to the rocks as possible is tip number 2. It's very, very important. You're almost going to want to be bouncing along the rocks, which is why the tackle that you're using has to be suited to that scenario. This is usually what I'm using. A lot of my weedless jig heads, weighted hooks, things like that are not going to get snagged as much. Very rarely am I bouncing open face jigs around these rocks because you're going to end up losing a lot of gear. It's going to be frustrating to try and get stuff unsnagged. And when you go up to unsnag things, you're going to be spooking off a lot of fish. So making sure that you're using weedless setups or you're using things that are not going to get snagged is very, very important. Suspending plugs can work well here, but I don't like to mess with treble hooks around rocks. And I just usually opt to use the weedless hooks like what we've got on our Power Prawn Junior. That's what I've been using the most. I really like to use crustacean imitations around rocks, especially shrimp, because they're usually feeding up on the oysters. They're usually feeding on the rocks with all those small microorganisms there. And I know it's a great forage bait to be using this time of year in the early spring, and redfish and trout have seemed to have loved it. So I'm just using the Power Prawn and weedless jig head. If that was, one bait I could recommend as a go-to. There's tons of other types of baits that will work. I'm not saying that's the only thing you have to use, but it's been producing for me very well. And while we're still on the subject of tackle, let's move on to tip number 3, which is don't be afraid to use a toppler. Again, we're fishing around structure that's submerged, especially on higher tides. You can actually fish right over those rocks. And again, with the current flow moving bait over the rocks themselves, a lot of predators are staged down current looking up, waiting for bait fish to get moved over the rocks. I do like crustacean patterns mainly around rocks, but if I find those aren't producing, I'm seeing a lot of mullet jumping around a specific area, I'm going to likely throw a spook or paddle a skitter walk over in that area and walk the dog over that structure. I've caught a lot of fish recently doing this at oyster bars because those fish are again staged at a deeper part of the bar or staged at a depth change close by. And as that bait's moved over those rocks or moved over that oyster bar, those predators are coming up and absolutely demolishing it. So I've had a lot of success with trout and redfish doing this. I've even heard of some flounder being caught up in the Carolinas near oyster bars with this tactic. So it's a very great way to get on a lot of fish. Don't expect to catch a ton of flounder doing it, but you can definitely get onto some reds and trout. So I hope this tip was helpful for you guys. And if you want to see more amazing fishing tips, I highly recommend you join us in the Salt Strong Insider Club.
So if you're new to Salt Strong, just know that we're the best online fishing club in America because we literally guarantee that you'll be catching more fish in less time while saving money on your tackle. We do this by providing you with premium education, an exclusive online fishing community, and access to group discounts on the best saltwater fishing tackle. To learn more, go to saltstrong.com. We hope to see you in the Insider Club family soon.